Welcome to Because the Beatles, the podcast about the Beatles, everything about the Beatles, 24/8. I'm Erica.
And I'm Allison. And before we start, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or stream us on Spotify and YouTube. And if you're enjoying BC the Beatles, feel free to leave us a preferably 5-star review so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
And don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter/X, and TikTok. We'll be posting videos, photos, and more from this episode and beyond. And you can also email us at bcthebeatles@gmail.com.
And here we are in January, and Erica and I are actually recording from the same city for once. We're not bi-coastal today.
Still not in
the same room, not in the same borough even in New York.
No, we're still practically a state away from each other, especially because this is the day of the great American 2026 snowstorm.
Yeah, I'm so glad I left LA and got here just in time to experience this huge freaking snowstorm. It is just a huge reminder of why I don't live in New York anymore. I picked the right time to come to New York, but alas, the snow has dampened my plans, but it's all right.
Well, I'm glad you're here. We saw each other last night. That was so much fun.
We did. It was fun. We went for some tiki drinks and, had a big catch up. So that was really super fun.
And next week, we're going to go see the band Bambikino. They're wonderful.
Yes, they're a band that tributes the Hamburg era of the Beatles and plays like songs they would have played in the Cavern and that kind of thing. And they're super fun. Erica and I saw them, probably about 10 years ago at a venue in Brooklyn. And yeah, I'm so excited to see them play again.
And I'm excited today, too. We are in January 2026, looking back at the events of January 1966. From the outside, 1966 was shaping up to be another banger year for Beatlemania from day one. The Beatles had just finished a UK tour, and their recent recordings, which were the We Can Work It Out backed with Day Tripper single and the Rubber Soul album, both released that past December, continued to dominate the charts in January. As far as anyone knew, the Beatles were continuing their pattern of seemingly endless success. Brian offered his predictions for the coming year. Quote, "I see 1966 as being very similar to last year for the Beatles, with progress being made musically as ever. On the other hand, I must state that no film plans have been finalized for the new year." His prediction, for better or for worse, would turn out to be astoundingly inaccurate. And Brian's mention of those unrealized film plans may have been the first clue that 1966 was going to be anything but similar to previous years. Now, this third film had been a subject of contention for the band and its entourage for about an entire year already. They wanted to have something to follow up with the successes of A Hard Day's Night and Help. And as early as February 1965, Brian had announced that the author Richard Condon, who was known for his 1959 bestseller The Manchurian Candidate, was being commissioned to create a screenplay of his 1961 novel A Talent for Loving. The commission was from Pickfair Films Limited, which was a company jointly owned by Brian and George Ornstein, who was the former European head of production with United Artists. Their tentative plans from the beginning were to film it in late 1965, possibly early 1966, in either Spain or in Mexico. It was based on this novel of the same name, and it was a parody novel of Westerns, and Western films, of course, with John Wayne and everything, were super, super popular at this time. And it is very true that the Beatles wanted to do something different for their next film. They didn't want to play themselves, and they didn't want to do another Bond-style caper like Help was. A Talent for Loving certainly fit the bill. Here's a synopsis. A Talent for Loving tells the tale of a 16th century Aztec priest who cut off his own hand and used the bloody stump to lay a curse upon a blasphemous Spanish conquistador and all his direct descendants. 3 centuries on, in 1871, the beautiful young virginal daughter of a fabulously wealthy Texas rancher and gambler is its latest victim. The action centers around a cowboy race run to decide who would win her hand in marriage. End quote.
Sounds interesting. I'm just trying to figure out which Beatle would play what and how they would adapt that for 4 potentially leads.
And would they be Liverpool cowboys? Would they be trying American accents?
I mean, we know they loved cowboys. Obviously, the cowboys were super popular with the Liverpudlians. We had the Searchers, who were named after the John Wayne film. But yeah, I don't know. Like, this is weirder than them wanting to make a movie of Lord of the Rings.
At least there were 4 of them.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing. There are 4 parts. Like, this sounds very strange.
Maybe Ringo was just going to play all the parts.
I was going to say Ringo would have been obviously the lead.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Ringo probably was pushing for this more than anybody else.
Exactly. He's a big country guy.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like a very weird movie. It sounds like it has a few elements of kind of the strangeness of help in it, actually.
That was my thought, too. Uh-huh.
So they were attracted to this from the beginning, and the screenplay was commissioned and it was written. But for some reason, the Beatles never seemed to fully commit. And it just kind of got more and more evasive as the year went on. So in summer of 1965, the Beatles' Hollywood agent Walter Shenson told the press, quote, "We are contracted for a 3rd picture. It will probably be A Talent for Loving, a novel of Richard Condon, which the Beatles own." All true. By the end of the summer, though, the Beatles started distancing themselves from the project, telling reporters that while they haven't had a chance to review the script yet, pre-production plans were coming together in either Spain or Mexico. Something was cooking, but they didn't know exactly what. By the time they returned from their U.S. tour in the fall of '65, their time was, of course, consumed by recording Rubber Soul. When they were asked again later that year, John said that while they should have started filming already, it had now gotten too late in the year and they were postponing due to the risk of bad weather. Now, in its place, Brian scheduled an impromptu UK tour for November and December 1965 because they were so committed to filming a 3rd film that as early as February 1965, they had cleared their schedule this time for this movie filming. Yet despite putting it off, there were still rumors floating around that the film was going ahead, that John and Paul would soon be writing the music, and they'd even started casting some of the other actors. But there were also rumors of doubts floating around. John had expressed concern that writing the title song would be difficult. And then the November '65 Beatles Book Monthly reported that, quote, Paul, George, and John were not too happy with certain parts of the screenplay. Ringo, as we mentioned, always a fan of cowboy culture, had been pretty enthusiastic all along. But I think Ringo lost out on this one because just a month later, the December Beatles Book Monthly reported that, quote, cowboys are out.
According to who? The Beatles? They totally maybe they just got fed up with this film project and it killed their love of cowboys.
Possibly. Yeah, I don't think they meant all cowboys, just these cowboys.
Just these cowboys, yeah. No bueno.
Not predicting a trend or anything.
Exactly.
But it took an entire year of speculation about this project before it was finally quashed. And so in January 1966, this particular movie was not going ahead, but there was still a tentative plan for some kind of film happening in '66. Nothing was definite, though. There were all kinds of rumors. KRLA Beat in LA reported that by January 1966, Walter Shenson had commissioned Max Wilk to write a new movie for them, set during the American Revolutionary War.
Oh my goodness. Just gets weirder and weirder.
I mean, which side are they on?
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense to me.
No, me either. And thankfully, it didn't happen.
Yeah, thankfully.
And Talent for Loving would be made in 1969, starring Richard Widmark and nothing to do with the Beatles, which is a good thing.
Yes, the story buried in the annals of movie history, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So with no film project, no tour, and no recordings planned, January 1966 was the start of an unprecedented period of relative inactivity. Reporters and fans alike would start to remark on the Beatles' relative silence, wondering if perhaps this signaled the moment when the bubble finally burst. But they had no idea this quest period would lay the groundwork for one of the quickest and most astounding metamorphoses in pop culture history. On January 4th, Brian flew to New York to begin negotiating the group's summer '66 U.S. tour. And then the next day, the Beatles were in the studio recording overdubs for the television broadcast of their Shea Stadium concerts from the previous summer. Now, there was a BBC documentary about to be made about the Shea Stadium concerts. And so they held this secret session at CTS Studios in London. And so they re-recorded vocals, bass, organ, guitar on a few different songs. And then they recorded I Feel Fine and Help in their entirety. And it's kind of important to note, at least to the Beatles' credit, this was not a performance-related issue, but it was more like technically not good enough for BBC standards. So that was why they decided to re-record. There wasn't enough time to improve Twist and Shout or Act Naturally. So for those, the recordings of their August 30th, 1965 Hollywood Bowl concerts were flown in. And then for Act Naturally, the studio version was used with some additional crowd noises added. This is all very rote for the time period, though. I mean, a lot of bands were doing these quote unquote live albums, but like re-recording their vocals and all this. So this doesn't surprise me that the Beatles did it too.
Hollywood Bowl doesn't look anything like Shea Stadium. I wonder how they would have pulled that off.
I don't know. I'm going to guess that the average BBC viewer wasn't well-versed in arena acoustics. So maybe, maybe it was easy to swap out those sound bites.
True. And maybe on a black and white tiny TV, it wouldn't have been so obvious that it was a completely different venue.
Yes, exactly. Blurry, black and white, 60s style. Sounds about right.
Do you remember Paul used to tell the story about the Shea Stadium PA system in concert? He would do an imitation of the baseball PA. It was very cute. Really cute.
I don't remember that. I'll have to look it up on YouTube.
Yeah, it was adorable.
Aw, Paul. So the Shea Stadium BBC doc was in the works. And then going back to the top of the show when we talked about Brian's prediction for the year, despite that, the Shea Stadium broadcast epitomized the Beatles' increasing discomfort with touring, which will be a big theme going into the summer of '66 and beyond. The bigger they got, the harder it was to play more complex music, and no one was listening to them anyway. And obviously their music was growing more and more complex and would only get more and more complex. So in order to show the broadcast, they had to try to recreate the live experience in the studio just so it could be heard. And they were not obviously enjoying the tour experience, and the session would have been a really harsh reminder of one of the major reasons why. Like, how annoying would that be to have to re-record your vocals just because they can't be heard anyway?
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And, they'd also reached the pinnacle of touring experience by playing Shea. In 1966, how much bigger could they get after playing to 55,000 fans? And other tour experiences would only make them look more diminished. Later on, when Michael Lindsay Hogg would suggest going to Tripoli and doing a huge concert there, I mean, what else are you going to do after you sort of like reach the summit of playing live? Tripoli might be your next destination,
How much bigger could you get?
Exactly.
An arena stadium in Tripoli. I wonder if that was another source of disappointment for the Beatles in touring, where they had this adrenaline rush of playing to an enormous, never before seen audience. And then they did this little tour of the UK just a few months later.
I don't know off the top of my head, like the venues they play, but I can't imagine an impromptu UK tour was going to be like playing Wembley,
No, they were on the north a lot. So probably smaller places. I mean, they weren't doing dance halls, but they were doing like the auditorium that you would probably see your local theater tour in.
Yeah, which obviously they'd way outgrown by then. So yeah, it was, the seeds of discontent were already being sown even early in the year, and it will become a huge theme as we go through '66 with their hatred of the touring experience. But unfortunately for them, Brian had some news on his trip to New York. He was announcing that the Beatles would tour the U.S. later that year in 1966, and he also laid plans to play Japan, Germany, and the U.K. So even though Brian named off these places that the Beatles were going to play, there were some kinks to be worked out, obviously. I don't think the UK dates ever happened. But this tour was going to be a little bit different for the Beatles. They were going to play places the Beatles hadn't visited before. And while visiting new countries was, of course, a natural part of their career progression, it was also Brian's effort to help them once again look forward to touring. So keeping it fresh, keeping it new. And he knew that the Beatles had become increasingly less keen on the tours. All the issues they encountered during the Shea Stadium overdub sessions underscored that fact. Plus, they were finding the process increasingly harder to take. They were noticing a change in the fandom, a move to a more intense devotion where the Beatles were being treated as like faith healers with sick kids being brought to them before every show, hoping just one touch from the Beatles could cure them.
Ugh,
Like, how
ugh,
crazy
ugh.
is that?
Oh my God.
They were so weirded out by this, especially John, who was like the main target of this like deification, which is a theme, obviously, still goes on today. The deification of John Lennon. We've talked about it so many times, on this
Yes.
podcast. John himself was like freaked out by it.
Yeah, he was very weirded out. I mean, we know that he had a discomfort with people who were ill or disabled, and he expressed that in a very uncomfortable way in the world.
Yeah, which they had to take out of the anthology, I guess.
Yeah, they did. But imagine just for him, I mean, obviously he was dealing with his discomfort in a very immature and a way that would be completely canceled in today's society.
Yeah.
But imagine somebody who already felt like that, who was having sick children brought to his dressing room, hoping that a touch from him would heal them.
I don't know if it was them, the parents, the priests. Like, where did this idea that the Beatles could cure illnesses come from? Like, I just want to know, like, where the seed of that was planted,
I could see that just as an observer, you're watching these screaming and fainting in a lot of ways. It's similar to a revivalist church sermon, people speaking in tongues, all this crazy stuff happening that doesn't happen in day-to-day life. And maybe people thought, well, whatever touch of spiritual magic happens in a revivalist church might be happening with the Beatles. Maybe it's the same spark there. And, I can imagine the desperation of
For sure.
with sick children wanting to give anything a try. We saw this with Elvis to some extent, even Sinatra to some extent, but not to the absolutely mind-losing fever pitch that came with the Beatles and Beatlemania. I can see how it might have happened, but it doesn't mean that it's any less horrible if you are on the receiving end of it, especially if you're like a 24-year-old guy.
Exactly. They're like young, they're so young to be experiencing this. What a crazy, crazy experience.
Yeah. And later in 1966, not to always bring it back to the Butcher cover, but this experience of deification of the Beatles in the fandom is one of the reasons why we have that series of pictures, because their photographer who was traveling alongside them, watching this stuff with them, was thinking about this and trying to find a way to turn that into an artistic statement.
Oh, that makes sense.
After finishing the Shea Stadium overdubs, John, Cynthia, Ringo, and Maureen took a vacation to Trinidad and Tobago. It was intended as a break from the chaos of Beatlemania, though they did have to do a little bit of diplomatic work. They were taken on a tour and a photo shoot by the Prime Minister, Eric Williams. But overall, they had a nice time and a break from the pressure. The photos from the vacation show John and Ringo relaxed, clowning around together, with Ringo sporting a beard for the first time since 1962 when he was with Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. So, nice little vacation beard on Ringo. He looks great.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, though, and I don't share this view at all, John's appearance, he had gained a little bit of weight, was criticized with the photos. He hated the photos, and this appears to be the origin point for his lifelong struggle with dieting and body dysmorphia, unfortunately.
Oh, I know he always called this period of like 65 going into 66 his fat Elvis period, which it just breaks my heart. He looks great. He looks like very healthy and he's on vacation enjoying himself. And it just sucks that then he's sort of like slapped in the face with these pictures he hates. We've all been there. I'll say it, but it's sad.
Yeah, it really sucks. He really got very skinny.
Oh, yeah.
Think about just the year. By the end of 66, he had premiered his short hair and granny glasses look. He was rail thin. So this affected him short amount of time.
Yeah, it sure did.
Now, moving on to Paul. His song, Woman, was released by the artists Peter and Gordon. Peter, of course, being Peter Asher, the brother of his girlfriend, Jane Asher, who he lived with when he was living in the Ashers' home. Paul tried to write this under a pseudonym. The world was told that this was written by Bernard Webb, who was a reclusive university student living in Paris who shunned all publicity. But he was quickly discovered because it sounds so much like a Paul McCartney song that nobody could deny what it was.
Yes, that tracks. That tracks. I love this is like Paul's. Well, it's not the beginning because, of course, we have like Paul Ramon and all that stuff. But, Paul's lifelong fascination with pseudonyms and being under pseudonym, which I think we talked about in our very first episode of this podcast.
Yes, Percy Thrills Thrillington, one of my favorite Paul pseudonyms and one that he actually kept going for a little while.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Woman may have been very classic McCartney, but with his own songwriting, Paul was starting to experiment with going in an entirely new direction as the song Eleanor Rigby was starting to take shape in his mind. Now, this was the first time that Paul had started writing a song, a story song that was in the third person that wasn't she loves you, I love you, from me to you, those kind of things. Completely third person, completely detached. At the time, it was compared closest to Ray Davies' well-respected man and dedicated follower of fashion, both of which came out just before and after this period of time. In Paul's song, the characters had names. They were very specific. And it was in January of 1966 that Paul was landing on those names. The first draft of Eleanor Rigby, the character was called Miss Daisy Hawkins. But he didn't feel it was quite right. And he was searching for the final name. And there are 3 theories about how he got there. The first was that it was inspired by Eleanor Bron, who was the actress who had recently starred opposite the Beatles in Help. The second one surfaced decades later because some fans found a grave in the Liverpool church in Woolton, which was the same one where John and Paul met at the Woolton Village Fete in 1957. Paul doesn't recall ever consciously seeing this or knowing about it until much later, but he concedes that possibly he did.
There's no way he didn't see it. Like, it's just too specific of a name,
I know. And he said that he and John would walk around the graves. So he definitely saw it. And, maybe it was just tucked away in his brain until a later date. But the catalyst and the most plausible story, I think, actually happened in January 1966. Paul was in Bristol to see his girlfriend, Jane Asher, in the play The Happiest Days of Your Life by John Dighton. It was playing at the Theatre Royal in Bristol from December 27th, 1965 through January 29th, 1966. So at some point this month, he was wandering around the town, thinking about the song, thinking about the name, and he saw a store with the name Rigby in it. It was Rigby and Evans, a wine and spirits importer. Maybe he saw the name Rigby and Rigby and Evans. Evans sounds a bit like Eleanor. Maybe it just all came together for him at that time.
It could be. I'd actually never heard that story.
It is a funny way of telling it in an interview. He talks about seeing it. He's like, quick pan to Bristol. I can see it like a movie. Very cute.
That's so Paul.
I know. Now, the other name in the story, Father Mackenzie, was also giving him trouble. And his original name for that priest was actually Father McCartney. He scrapped that very quickly and he said, quote, "But I thought people would think it was supposed to be about my dad sitting knitting his socks. Dad's a happy lad."
I'm glad he changed that because, later we had Let It Be about his mother. So,
Yeah. And people wouldn't have thought it was about Father McCartney. They would have thought it was a weird thing that Paul was writing about himself.
That's true. It could have been like a self-reflection or something.
Oh, the amount of ink that would have been spilled analyzing that. I'm so glad it was saved. Thank you, Paul.
People will write a book on anything Beatles related, right, Erica?
No kidding. The crazy things that people want to talk about these days. God.
The crazy stuff, the crazy minutia. I'm kidding.
The butcher cover is very important.
The butcher cover is very important. I'm excited to read your book.
And it wasn't only the structure of the song that was revolutionary, really. It was the subject matter. It was about loneliness, which was a topic in the zeitgeist at that moment. including a discussion about loneliness in the elderly that was being discussed in the House of Commons in 1965. And there were a few pop songs out there like Simon and Garfunkel, like I Am a Rock, that discussed it in more of a roundabout way. But this was very blatant, very obvious, all the lonely people. You certainly weren't going to be dancing along to this in a concert.
No. And of course, as it takes shape, it has such a dark, ominous string part to it. And it becomes this really haunting sort of song.
He was really redefining what it meant to write a pop song.
For sure. Well, talking about loneliness, let's go to the opposite side of the street on that one, because on January 21st, we had a very happy occasion in the Beatle world when George and Pattie Boyd were married. Pattie was this very glamorous, beautiful model. And, George had met on the set of A Hard Day's Night. She's very cute in that movie. And I love watching it and thinking about them just meeting and falling in love and everything and all that good stuff. Prisoners. Her very famous line, yes, prisoners. So their wedding, everything about it was planned by Brian. Obviously, at this time, his main goal was avoiding Beatles publicity. They decided on an 11 a.m. ceremony at Epsom Registry Office, followed by a quiet luncheon back at George and Pattie's home in Weybridge. And they had a very limited amount of guests there. They included Pattie's mother, her siblings, and her step-siblings, her uncle, and her great-aunt, and both of George's parents. Brian was the best man, filling in for Pattie's father, who was divorced from her mother and living far from them. In the Beatles world, only Brian and Paul attended. John and Ringo wouldn't return from Tobago until the 23rd. And there are such cute photos of all of them together at George and Pattie's wedding. And there are very funny stories about Paul being so shit-faced in these photos. There's a photo of him like kissing Pattie on the cheek, and he's holding a drink in his hand, and he looks very, very drunk. And it's hilarious.
So hammered.
He's so drunk. He's so drunk in those pictures. It's hilarious.
It's probably noon. No later than noon.
Exactly. I know. It has to be. If it was an 11 o'clock ceremony, I don't know. How long does that take? Like 20 minutes or something? And then it's off to the luncheon,
Which was very close to the registrar's office anyway. So they were tying it on almost immediately.
That's hilarious. I love that. Paul's just like, fuck it. I'm going to get drunk at like 11:45 in the morning. One of my favorite things about the wedding is that George and Pattie both wore Mary Quant, who's one of my favorite 60s designers. Pattie wore a dark red silk dress, a fox fur coat, creamy stockings, red shoes, and a bow in her hair. And George wore a black Victorian-style suit and a fur coat, which was also designed by Mary Quant.
And we would see that coat later in Let It Be.
We would, yes. Pattie, obviously, again, was a very famous model at this point. She was the height of the mod fashion. But her idea of her wedding was a little bit different. She had wanted a white wedding with a traditional dress and a large attendance. The mod look was really George's preference, and the need for speed and secrecy took precedence over her desire for a big wedding, unfortunately. It was so secret that George's father told Melody Maker, we knew they were getting married, but they couldn't tell us exactly when until about 3 days before the actual day. So even the families were kind of like kept in the dark, so they wouldn't spill the beans. All in all, it was actually kind of a happy event. It was rushed and secretive, but it turned out okay in the end until they get divorced. But we'll talk about that later. Both of George's parents approved of Pattie, and Mrs. Harrison told Melody Maker that, quote, Pattie is a nice, natural girl. She can cook good English things like chicken and leg of lamb. That's all you need, really. So they would wait a couple of weeks to honeymoon, and they traveled to Barbados in early February. And lots of beautiful pictures from their honeymoon. George, at this point, his marriage was a marker. So he was growing up. He was expanding his circle. He was kind of moving with different sectors of people. And even more than that, he was developing another all-encompassing love for the sitar. He had discovered the instrument while filming Help. It was used in the sequence filmed in an Indian restaurant very famously. He was still kind of beginning. He was a bit of a novice. The sitar's first appearance had been in Norwegian wood at this point. When one of the sitar strings broke during the recording session, George was such a novice that he didn't know how to replace it. So his search for a string led him to call the High Commission of India, and he was referred to an organization called the Asian Music Circle. So this is a very important event in George's life, actually, because his introduction to the Asian music circle put him in contact with Eastern musicians, including Ravi Shankar, who would be a huge influence on George for the rest of his life. And George's obsession with the sitar obviously impacted him in many, many other ways, including his focus on Eastern religion, again, really for the rest of his life. So this is a really transformative time for him. He was getting married. He was starting this new life. He was exploring all these new interests that would really impact him on a really cellular level, introducing him to people like Ravi Shankar and his introduction to the Eastern philosophy. So George was a little bit busy on the inside in January of 66.
It really is shocking when you think about all of the things that snowballed into crazy changes for them down the line. The plot of Help was very weird and involved this Eastern style cult, and there was an Indian restaurant scene in that because of it, and there was a sitar in the scene because of the strange plot, and he just gravitated to it, and it changed his entire life.
I mean, what would have happened had that sitar not been in that restaurant?
God knows, because that, like you just said, was the gateway to his thoughts in Eastern religion.
Yeah, it was hugely impactful on George.
Now, George wasn't the only Beatle who was opening his mind. We did talk a little bit about Paul's widening of his compositional styles, but Paul's outlook was widening in many ways at this time. On January 28th, he attended the opening of the Indica Bookshop and Gallery, which was owned by his good friend Barry Miles, Peter Asher, and John Dunbar. Now, the Indica Gallery would come to play a huge part in John and Yoko's story, of course, and Barry Miles in Paul's as he wrote his authorized biography many years from now. It was also the first time that Paul appeared in public with his other girlfriend, Maggie McGibbard, the 21-year-old model and nanny for Marianne Faithfull and John Dunbar's son. Now, Paul and Jane were very much an item when they were both in town. But when they weren't, well, he and Maggie, who was also in a relationship of her own, seemed to find each other again and again and again. Of course, Jane had no idea of this. Paul, at that time, for the past year, Paul and Jane had been having more and more disagreements. It showed up in his songwriting, where in 1963 and 1964, Jane had inspired songs like And I Love Her. She was now the catalyst for more emotionally heavy and complex themes like in I'm Looking Through You, For No One, and We Can Work It Out. The core of their arguments usually centered around Jane's job. Paul wanted her to quit acting and be a more traditional wife to him should they get married, while Jane, who had been a successful actor since she was a child, had every intention of working regardless of her relationship status. Paul would actually have this open, secret relationship with Maggie until he married Linda in 1969. It was much more intense than a lot of press stories make it out to be.
Yeah, Maggie is mostly just like a footnote. You know, sometimes she'll get a mention, but she was really there for a lot of formative years for Paul.
But beyond Paul's girlfriends, Paul's presence at the Indica opening was further proof of two wider-reaching issues. First, the overall merging of high art and pop culture that was rapidly becoming the norm in the mid-60s. And secondly, Paul's own expanding intellectual and artistic interests. In December 1965, he detailed some of these interests in an article in London Life magazine. It's amazing. Check out London Life magazine. Check out the archives. It was a short-lived publication, maybe a year and a half, but it profiled and celebrated the cutting edge of the swinging 60s mod culture. And it's
oh my God, I've never heard of it. I'm so excited. I'm going to look up those archives.
Wonderful. Yes, please do. It's great. This article was essentially 4,000 words of Paul's running monologue given to a journalist at London Life. And Paul mentioned some of his current interests, and they were wide-ranging, included Handel, Eugene O'Neill, the playwright Alfred Jarry, and The Who. And he also telegraphed the Beatles' philosophy on their own creative restlessness. He said, quote, I think the good thing about us is that we keep contradicting ourselves. I saw someone on TV asked what he wanted out of life, and he said, a cozy rut. To be in a cozy rut is about the sickest thing ever, I think. You can enjoy it, but what's the point of living in a cozy rut? We could stay in one now forever, repeating our early hits. And if we did come up with something exciting, we'd have to scrap it. Now, while Paul was actively experiencing everything life could offer him, John appeared to be deliberately turning away from everything. The huge mansion he bought in Weybridge the previous year was meant to be refuge from life as a Beatle, but in a lot of ways, it just became another kind of prison for him, stuck there in this huge mansion with Cynthia, with Julian. After his trip to Tobago, the Beatles' unexpected period of quiet nudged John further inside himself. He stayed home. He took incredible amounts of LSD. He said, quote, he ate it. He watched TV, he read lots of books, and very possibly he was in a period of depression.
I could see that. I mean, you're go, go, go all the time as a Beatle and doing all these things, and you're coming off of a hectic year in 1965, and then you're coming off of a trip where you got body shamed in the press and by fans. So I could see where it might lead to John just sort of being in the dumps.
He didn't want to get married. He didn't want fatherhood. He really didn't want to live in the, stockbrokers row section of the suburban rich guy world
Right.
off of London. He didn't want any of these things. And I think probably compounding that was that this life full of artistic and absurdist and surrealist and intellectual culture once associated with John and only with John and the Beatles was now being actively lived by Paul. I mean, I can see that might have upset him on some level. He had every ability to go out and experience it, but, depression's a bitch. Sometimes you just can't. But it wasn't that he was stagnant. If he was eating LSD, he was also voraciously consuming books. He read so many books. He was reading a lot about philosophy and religion at this time. And he was developing some new ideas of his own, which I think we'll hear about those in coming months in 1966 quite a bit.
Very much looking forward to that. This is, again, planting seeds in John as George is also transforming. So, it's a big time of growth for both of them. And Paul, Paul is exploring his artistic side. And a little bit of an organizational note, housekeeping, if you will, on January 29th. The Vic Lewis organization and the NIMS Enterprises organization announced their merger. So Vic Lewis, if we think back a little bit, Vic had been a big band musician, but as that genre declined, he went into artist management. And later, after Brian's death, he also became the managing director of NIMS. And he would also handle the career of like Cilla Black and Robin Gibb. And he was a very influential manager after Brian died. Brian had, at this point, been branching out beyond the Beatles and even beyond music management. In 1965, Brian had sort of realized a dream of his when he leased West End's Savile Theatre. Though in January 1966, the Savile was hosting a 10-week residency by the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company. Brian would soon turn it into a rock and roll venue hosting greats such as Jimi Hendrix, Little Richard, one of Brian's favorites, the Four Tops, and one of mine too. But for now, it was still more associated with classic arts, with the Gilbert and Sullivan troupe. And he was also in negotiations to become part owner of the soon-to-be merged Disc and Music Echo papers, which is really interesting to me. I sort of feel like that's like, what do they call it? Like a vertical monopoly?
Yeah.
Having a music manager be a partner of the music press. Very interesting. But, thinking back to Brian, and we started this episode talking about Brian and where he was in his head at this point. He must have really felt like he was coming to a crossroads with the Beatles. He felt the Beatles' discomfort with touring. He saw the beginning of their musical progression. And the thought must have been planted in his head, if the band one day made the choice to stop touring, what would his role really be? Like with Shea Stadium, had he reached the pinnacle of his success as a manager in 1965, what was left for him in 66? What was to come? Despite his earlier assurances that 66 would be a similar year to 65, January planted the seeds for a number of new directions. So no filming, a reticence to touring, increased exposure to arts and culture, and a sense that the Beatles were becoming less of a, quote, four-headed monster, with every new milestone. It seems like a relatively quiet period for the Beatles because they're not active in the studio, they're not filming something, but it really is kind of a gestational period for them.
Yeah, and I find it so interesting how all four of them did something different. Like John retreated into himself, into literature. Paul exposed himself to the world and was out there even more. George got married and
Literally got married.
Yeah, he got married. He discovered something that would lead to spiritual growth. And then Ringo, we didn't mention Ringo much. Ringo was happy as a clam.
Yeah, Ringo was, he was happy with Maureen. He loved Mo. He loved his new baby.
We'll talk about this next month when we talk about February 1966. The portrait of Ringo that Maureen Cleave made of him was lovely. It was lovely. Maybe he was the stabilizing force at this moment because he was the one who was actually very happy with where he was.
That's very Ringo of him.
Yeah. Even though he couldn't do his cowboy movie.
Aw, poor Ringo. But he got to be a star and the other ones.
He sure did. Well, that's January 1966. And next time, as I mentioned, we'll look at February, where the Beatles' expanding worldviews become public as journalist Maureen Cleave conducts revealing profiles of John, Paul, George, Ringo, and Brian. One of these profiles would become damaging in a way that no one could have predicted later in the year. And thanks again for listening to BC the Beatles. As always, subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you're listening right now, and give us a rating or review so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
And be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter/X, and TikTok. We'll be posting photos and more from this episode and beyond. Remember, you can always drop us a line at bcthebeatles@gmail.com, and we will see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.